All right.
All right. Hello, John. Welcome to the live stream. It's such an honor and pleasure to have you have this conversation with audience in China.
It's my pleasure.
I think the reason we have this privilege is because you have two books, both are translated to Chinese. One is Rewiring Education, and then the second one is My Days at Apple, which both of them are fascinating books. But I did notice both of those books came, recently, meaning after, all the major chapters and years of your career and life. Can you share a little bit of like what triggered you to write those books?
I think the first book, which was Rewiring Education, really was a reflection of my own experience in education, in that I sort of memorized my way through school. But in my junior year, in the final exam of my physics exam, there was only one problem on the exam, and it was to describe the motion of a spinning top in free space, which had never been covered in the lecture, nor had it been covered in the book. And I watched a lot of really smart people panic because they hadn't memorized the answer. And that's when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to memorize my way through life. Um, so I wrote the book after my own personal experiences, after retiring at the age of 36 and taking over a small private school and having run Apple's education business for 18 years. So it's a combination of my experience, and it called for a different pedagogy. In other words, a different learning environment in the classroom. Um, it called for an environment that was relevant. It called for an environment that was where the students were creative. It called for an environment where a collaborative environment, because we learned from each other. And yet, when I went to school, collaboration was called cheating, because every project I ever had was a single person project. And it finally called for an environment that was a problem that was challenging. We made the distinction between intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. Most education systems are based on extrinsic motivation, which doesn't really guarantee that it's relevant to the student. And the main difference in challenge-based learning and project-based learning is, in challenge-based learning, there's always technology involved. And also the challenge is chosen by the student, which guarantees that it's relevant. So that was the essence of rewiring education. The second book really was written because I always felt that a lot of people were writing books about Steve that did not know Steve. Steve hired me when he was 21 and I was 29, and I raised the average age of the company 2 years. And I had a different relationship with Steve because I was trained, as you know, as a computer scientist. I have both an AB degree and a master's degree and doctorate work in computer science. So I brought something to Steve in addition to my age. You know, I always thought maybe they hired me because they wanted an adult in the room, but they in the early Apple days they didn't even realize how much they needed software. Because if you think about the original Apple II, you had to be a basic programmer or an assembly language programmer to buy the Apple. I mean, to do something with it. There were no app stores. There were no third-party software houses. And so my first job at Apple was to be the director of new products, working for Steve, who was the vice president of new products. But within about 5 months, they realized that they probably pretty much saturated the market for those people who could code in assembly language or basic, and they needed software. So they made me vice president of software. So I had a different and unique relationship with Steve. And so I just felt that a lot of the books were unfair to Steve, that they never captured the human side of Steve. They always focused strictly on the business. And even some books referred to his management style as managing by fear. And that was totally opposite. Steve managed by inspiration. He believed you could do something that you yourself didn't even think you could do. So, for instance, when he hired me, he said, John, I want you to design a computer that everyone could use. And my thinking was, okay, great, where's the book? And they realized there was no book. And I said, well, has somebody done this in the past? And I realized no one had done it. And that's when it sort of tied back to the education book, because I needed to be able to solve problems whose answers were in the back of the book. That I really needed an education that challenged me with real relevant problems. And that's where I think education needs to be today. The student needs to be creative. They need to work on something that's relative that they relate to. They need to work in teams because we learn from each other, and they want to be challenged. I think we've learned that from the gaming industry. There's always another level, and you keep going. And in education, it tends to be read the chapter, answer the questions at the back of the book. The test is on Friday, and we're going to retest you in midterm, and we're going to retest you in the final. And then, you're going to go away for the summer and you're going to forget everything you learned. Right? And then you're going to go to work and they're going to ask you to do something like Steve asked me to do that had never been done before. So that's how those two books really tie together.
Yeah, thank you so much. For the audience, you probably already gathered from this conversation. So John was one of the very first group of employees, and you was number 54, if I remember
That's
right,
correct. Yes. Yeah.
into
Yeah.
Apple, and that was 1978.
You're just dating me now,
Yeah, so it's such a privilege for us to have, both having being able to read the book. And I actually read the reviews of the book on Amazon. Like, they're all excellent. They're saying, if you wish you were a fly on the wall during the early days of Apple, here you go. This is a very factual recollection from somebody like John, who has known Steve, both, of course, professionally first and personally very deeply over the early chapters of Apple, and very formative years. So thank you for putting that out. And also, I think I find your own story fascinating as well, because you were one of the first, if I remember, 50 computer science students from Berkeley, right?
Yes, I transferred from the University of California at Riverside as a physics major to Berkeley in 1968, because that was the first year that Berkeley created a computer science division. That was separate. It was not in the engineering department. It was not in the math department, but it was a degree in computer science. And so I got in very early in the game. And I think there were 50 of us that graduated that first year. And
Yeah.
then I did my master's at Berkeley, and then I spent a couple of years working on a PhD. And they wanted me to do my dissertation on proving programs, correct, and which never did pan out. And I wanted to do it on human machine interface and error recovery. So we parted ways, and but you know what? I met this young man by the name of Steve Jobs 5 years later, who wanted to solve the same problem that I did, and the rest is history. And that's documented in Todd Rose's book. I think what's the name of the book? Dark Horses. He documents that particular story with the point that stick to your passion. If you're passionate about something, follow it, rather than walking in well-worn footsteps of the past.
Yeah. Yeah. And then also you had you actually, before, when you met with Steve, you were with HP, right?
Hewlett Packard, yes.
Hewlett Packard, and you're working directly with Bill Hewlett around that time too.
Yeah, well, I guess I don't want to say roommate, but my office mate was his son. and I was picked as one of the early risers in the company. So I did get to meet with Bill Hewlett himself, right? And kind of ironic, Bill Hewlett was one of Steve's Jobs's favorite people because, as you know, Steve called Bill Hewlett cold and
When he was
asked for,
13 or something, right?
yeah, and asked for some equipment, and Bill gave him a job, but he had never met him. So the first thing Steve asked me to do when I joined Apple was, "Can you introduce me to Bill?" So I did.
That's remarkable. I mean, those, of course, I think back then might seem just the common day stories, but they're all very legendary, figures in the recent history of computer science now. And in the book, you mentioned how the first days at Apple, which is, I think you mentioned this very particular example where Steve thinks very differently than a typical logic-based or whatever analytical.
Well, yeah, Steve was very much a visionary and very confident. In fact, I tell a story in the book about my first day on the job as director of new products. I had two meetings set up. One was for a printer to go, basically a silent printer for the Apple II, and the second one was a modem. And I remember it so clearly because the first meeting was with the people who had created the silent printer, and I ushered them into a conference room, and I put the printer in the middle of the table, and they were dressed in suits and ties, and I waited for Steve to join the meeting, and Steve came into the meeting barefoot with soiled Levi's with holes in his knees and a kind of a dirty t-shirt, and he sat in the middle of the table in a lotus position and picked up the printer and said, "This is a piece of blank." And I went, and I go, "Oh my gosh, how do I recover from this?" And then I politely ushered them out and apologized for Steve. And then a few hours later, Dennis Hayes, who did the first DC Hayes modem, arrived with a beautiful little plastic box about the size of a pack of cigarettes, a little bit bigger, and did the same thing. I ushered them into the room. They were in three-piece suits. I put it in the middle of the table. Steve came in, the same outfit, sat in the middle of the table in a lotus position, picked it up and said, "I'll take $1 million." And Dennis Hayes, of course, says, "What? I can't make $1 million." But right there, I saw the two extremes of Steve Jobs. The brutally honest side of Steve, and then this visionary side of Steve.
Yeah, it must be shocking, but very
It was
real.
a little bit of a shock, yes. And remember, I had been trained as a manager at Hewlett Packard, which was a little bit more professional.
Yeah. And also I think only when I was reading the book, I started to realize how kind of groundbreaking some of your work are, because for example, Lisa was the first kind of graphic interface, right? And then you were in charge of developing that. Can you tell us a bit of that story?
Well, it really stemmed from a time that I was early in the computer science department at Berkeley, and I would go home. I would probably take the same route that you took, drive from Berkeley to Southern California, bypassing where I live right now. And I went home one Christmas, and my mom was managing. She had her own women's health club, and my dad was trying to help her with the books and the administration. And he said, "John, I can't keep up with your mom. I just don't know whether or not people are signing subscriptions because they met her or because of our ads. I don't know when the subscriptions expire. I'm just really having difficult time managing the business for her." And I said, "Well, did you ever think about writing a computer program?" And he goes, "Oh, I wouldn't know how to do that. Could you do that for me?" And I said, "Sure." So we went down to Radio Shack, Tandy, and which used to be a leather company that was selling what was called the Trash 80. It was a $600 computer, and I wrote a basic program for him to manage my mom's business. The problem was every time I went home, well, first of all, we opened the box in my mom's living room, and a cockroach ran out. Obviously, the Tandy was from Texas, right? And my mom said, "Get that thing out of my living room," right? So we put it in the garage, and I wrote the program in the garage. But every time I went home, my dad had something new that he needed. And I would spend my holidays in the garage programming. And so I wrote a paper called Datagramming. And I said, we've got to, programming, we write the program, but is it possible where a user could specify the data and the relationship of the data, and then the program would generate itself? And that basically became, in my mind, VisiCalc. That was the first piece of software that my dad could actually define the elements of his business and the relationships with the business. So that's, so I knew that when Steve offered me the job at Apple, that the personal computer, yes, was going to be personal and empower people like my dad.
Mm.
And so, when I saw things like PageMaker, which really, PageMaker probably, where VisiCalc was the software that really catapulted the sales of the Apple II, PageMaker was the software, and I was an early investor in that catapulted the Mac and changed the publication industry. So, yeah, I was very fortunate to be in that. And then I remember being at Berkeley in the 60s. My undergraduate was in 69, master's in 70, and doctorate work up until 72. And I remember sitting at Lawrence Hall in front of a $7.5 million CDC 6600 computer. And I remember looking out the window and seeing the protests. And I thought to myself, you guys think you're going to change society with your protests. I'm sitting in front of the technology that will change society. So, when Steve offered me the job, I knew that it would be successful, but I also knew that he needed software. And even though he didn't hire me as vice president of software to begin with, that came 5 months later. And so I became their first VP of software.
Wow. Yeah. No, it's in a way, when I was reading your book, I came to appreciate, because your character is very different from Steve's, and you're very practical and low key, and you get things done. And that's why probably, as you said in the beginning, there's so many books about Steve, but like people like yourself actually didn't bother to write one, because you actually, first of all, you have really known him at a different level, and second, you've actually sort of are the person who are behind the products that get delivered. I wonder, are there challenges, because Steve, of course, is, everybody now know him very well by now, giving all the books out, but working in that environment, was it very challenging for you?
You're only as good as the people you can surround yourself with. And I was able to hire some incredible people. I think initially it was a little bit challenging, because you're making you're going from one culture to another. But a lot of the aspects of the HP culture, in terms of empowering people, we were able to instill also in Apple. And again, because I was a little older than Steve, and I was educated in computer science, and which at that time was quite new to him, he kind of trusted me. He kind of built up trust. But there was always a time. I remember when I hired a young lady, and I'll leave names out, but I hired a young lady to be the training manager, as we needed to train people on how to use the graphical user interface. And she was very headstrong, and Steve ran into her on the campus, and that meeting didn't go well, and so he called me at 2 o'clock in the morning and told me to fire her. And I won't use the words that he used, but he said, you need to fire her. And I said, well, Steve, if you want to fire her, you can fire me. And then, because she works for me, you can fire me and then you can fire her. And, and I just left it like that because Steve wanted people to, Steve respected people that stood up to him, who could stand up to him, right? And about 2 months later, he says to me, man, is she good? And I said, yeah, and you wanted to fire her, So, I was blessed to be at Apple in the early stage, to be a little older than Steve, to be trained in a field that Steve learned very, very quickly from Next. So I had a different relationship with Steve, and through the years I get the call at 2 o'clock, and I was in example one. I was at Harvard addressing the faculty, and they came in and said, Steve's on the phone, he needs to talk to you now. So so I excused myself and I got on the phone, and it had to do with the 10 for Teachers program, where I had done a study. This is the second time I came back, and I was made vice president of education based on the 10 years that I'd spent running a school. And I had done a study and realized that only 6% of the K-12 education population could run OS 10. Everybody was still on an Apple II. And so we came up with the 10 for Teachers program, where we were going to give every person in North America a free copy of OS 10. And I remember, with Steve and Phil Schiller, coming up with the program. And I asked Steve, I said, how many teachers do you think will take us up on this? He said, 10 or 15,000. Well, 500,000 teachers took advantage of getting a free OS 10. And it was a free program. And so Steve was on the phone, and he was, using some foul language and saying, why are you letting people opt out of a free program? And I said, well, Steve, that's the law. Are you telling me I can break the law? And of course, Steve's response was, well, look, I got a board meeting. I'm busy. I'll get back to you. Well, he never got back to me. But, if you had a valid response and you could communicate that quickly, Steve would back off. And so I just had, a different relationship with Steve. I remember 3 instances, which, I remember I had hired an intern, and the intern happened to be a Christian, and she had a picture of Jesus on her wall, and Steve came and ripped it apart, threw it down. And then when I retired from Apple at age 36 and went to take over this failed school, Christian school, Steve told me, he said, I don't share your conviction, but I respect you for having one. And then later on, when Steve found out that he had cancer, he called me and said, you're one of the most trustworthy people I know. So, that's the Steve that I knew. Steve had difficulty with saying I made a mistake. His way of apologizing would be, at least with me, he would come up and he would say, how's the family? He would ask me something personally, and that was his way of saying everything's good. And so I miss him. He was brilliant, not only in being creative, but in the timing to be creative. When to introduce a product. And I wrote another book called Leadership by Vision, because vision is why you do something. The mission is what you do. And the strategy is how you do it. And I think Apple is successful today because Steve's vision came from that Scientific American article where they measured the efficiency of motion. And man was, a disappointing bottom of the list. But someone had the foresight to rerun the test, this time with man and woman riding a bicycle, which amplified their physical ability. So Steve saw technology as a mental bicycle, as an amplifier to help, not to go where we've already been, but to be creative, to be innovative. And so that was the why. And that why is still in place at Apple. Now, the what has changed over time, right? From a personal computer to an iPod, to an iPad, to, et cetera, a watch. But the why still holds for Apple. And I think that's one of the reasons that they're still successful to this day. And a lot of businesses get the vision and the mission mixed up. Simon Sinek said it the best, start with the why.
Mhm.
And I'm in a lot of Simon's books because we sort of have the same kind of management, leadership type beliefs.
Yeah. Well, that's deeply touching. Sharing. Thank you for sharing that. It's true. It's the why and then what and the how. And then but eventually it feels
And the
like
who. Don't
and the
forget
who.
the who. Those are the people that take the journey, right?
That's
The reward
right.
is in the journey.
Right. Yeah. And then, but sometimes I think some of the sort of issues people run into is too much around the how. Like lots of the tension is around how to do things, but sometimes maybe the what is wrong. And even sometimes when the what is right, maybe the why is never clear.
Well, see, the how opens up different opinions on how to do something. But if you can take that back to the why you're doing it, okay, and get an agreement on the why, um, you can save yourself from a lot of infighting on the how. I mean, I remember, hiring MBAs from Stanford who thought we should connect 6 Apple IIs together and have a cheap time sharing system. But that wasn't Steve's why. Steve's why was the personal computer, right? And just to amplify the power of that personal computer over time, not connect them, as a mini supercomputer.
Right. Well, there are quite a few gems in the earlier sort of chapter you shared. I think one is this why, the deeper sense. The other, I really adore the story you shared on how you kind of talk back at Steve, or how you hold your ground and being assertive. And then that's actually quite difficult, I would say, right? Because it's giving, of course,
You have to be quick.
right.
Yeah, Steve would, if you couldn't communicate your ideas, your solutions to him in about a minute, you were in trouble. He would take control. I think I share a story in the book about Eddie Q. And we all experienced that.
Yeah. So for our readers, again, you can find the link to the book, at the bottom of the live stream room. I'll say this in Chinese. 大家可以在直播间看到这样的2本书，然后这里面书里面讲了非常多他们当年在Apple 的时候的一些故事，包括他自己的一些选择等等，非常有价值，非常有趣啊！大家可以在直播间里看到。Okay, so back to the why. I wonder during your time, with Apple, with Steve, because how often do you actually talk about it? I know it's omnipresent, it must be here, but I would imagine in most workplaces people talk a lot about how, right? Because that's what you do. So how was the sort of experience reflecting that level of connection? Like what kind of discussion happens at the why level?
Yeah, well, I think it sort of underpinned everything. I mean, I met with Steve every Wednesday morning, as a team, a marketing team. We would have we had beer busts on Friday afternoon, so these were kind of more informal, the beer busts, but you would learn what people are doing on the how at the beer bust, whereas if you waited for a written report, that was coming 30 days later. And, you know, and you could use the why to redirect the how, right? You know, I remember designing the Lisa interface, and particularly the garbage can, you know. And, you know, some people wanted a garbage can with flies flying around it, and other people wanted the more traditional office type of garbage can. And that's one of the reasons I created some of the banners that we talk about in the book. You know, let's not argue about diamonds and diamonds and emeralds when the whole world has coal. You know, it was things like this that brought people back to the why we were doing something, and that could adjust the how. You know, bring it right back, that we're in trying to empower an individual to change their lifestyle by allowing them to be more creative and more innovative, to go places that they've never been before. So we would bring it back to the why. And I did the same thing in the school. You know, when I retired from Apple at age 36, I spent 10 years, you know, did the same thing. Here's the why this school exists. Here's, you know, here's what we need to do. Here's the direction that we're going to take. Here are the people that are going to take on that journey. And rather than focusing on rules and regulations, let's focus on relationships, right? And so that model that I extracted from early Apple days worked for me when I took over, when I was asked to run the school. It worked for me when I went on to Double Twist, which was the genomics company. And it's actually worked for my life, because if you really think about it, ask the question is, why am I here? And what is it I'm supposed to do? And how should I do that? And who is taking this journey with me, right? And what are the rules of my journey, you know? Or is it really just, to be good to people, you know, to help people when there's needs. It's formed really who I am as a person. And so I've been blessed. I mean, when I think back on it, I found this little nice saying that's going in my new book. It says the years teach much that the days never knew. The years teach much that the days never knew. So I'm writing a new book now. I'm looking back at my life, and I'm looking at the circumstances, the events. You know, I lost my father, was killed when I was 6. You know, what impact did that have on me, on my life? You know, when I was 9, I lost my sister who was 7. When I was 11, I lost another sister. You know, how did those circumstances impact my life? And so I'm writing a book now that sort of unpacks not the business journey, but the more personal journey of my life, and hoping that I can help people that may be going through some of the similar type circumstances in their
Wow.
lives, you know.
Wow. Thank you I didn't know that early
Yeah.
tragedy group. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Is there a name of the book yet, or is it?
Yeah, it's named after, during COVID. That's when I wrote the 2 books, you know, sort of during COVID. I also produced 4 CDs of more worship music, and one of the songs was called Ordinary Man, and that's the name of the
Hmm.
Ordinary Man.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. I'm so looking forward to that
that's a
book.
hard one. That's a hard one to write, you know,
I
because you
imagine.
gotta bare your soul.
Right, right. Because it's an extraordinary journey for any ordinary man.
Well, you know, from a Christian perspective, Jesus became ordinary. He walked
Right.
the earth.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
the tie. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I look forward to that book. And then thank you so much. Yeah, that was I think probably our audience has been having the same curiosity, because you mentioned quite a few times, it's all in the book as well. The fact that you left Apple at age 36. Of course, you're financially successful, you can retire, but it's a very different choice you've made. You went to run a failing school. Can you
No,
share?
I gave it all away though. So
Huh?
I gave it all away. So that's why I went back to work.
Work.
You know, and I went back, and so I went back originally with Mayfield, which was a venture capital firm, as a executive in residence, and they dropped me in some early internet companies, and also with a company by the name of Pangea, which was the genomics company. But in the process of defining a vision and a mission for them, I changed the name to Double Twist, and we
Mm.
created a research environment for individual scientists, because at that time you had to work for a pharmaceutical company or a bioinformatics company that had the funds. Well, we created an environment that any scientist around the world could have access to. We created software agents that that took your sequence and said it's patent, or it's found, in a literature here, or it's homologous to this particular protein. So the goal there was, again, to empower the individual scientists. And the irony of it, of course, was um, the Friday that they asked me to take over as CEO, I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. I go away from the Silicon Valley for 10 years, and I come back and I get a CEO job. And so I accepted it. Steve called me Saturday morning and said, I'm going back to Apple. I want you to go with me. And I said, Steve, I'm driving 50 miles to Oakland every day. If you'd called me yesterday, but I gave them my word. And, and Steve said, I respect that. Call me as soon as you're freed up. And 5 years later, we sold it to Hitachi, and I was freed up, and Steve said, come on in. And that's how I got back to Apple. But
Yeah.
Steve and his genius, when I left Apple, when I told Steve that I needed to figure out my life, because it was moving at 100 miles an hour, and I wasn't home for my family and my kids. He said something to me. He said, John, remember I said, I don't share your conviction, but I respect you for having them. But he also said, great, why don't you take your business acumen into the educational community? And he says, and then bring what you learned there back to the business. So he basically forecasted that I would be back at Apple. I mean, that's how in tune he was, right? I thought, okay, my Apple days are over. Little did I know that he would bring me back to run Apple's education business.
Yeah. Yeah. And then also you mentioned timing as well, right? Because this in tune.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure maybe it's in your new book. Any insights in the deeper sense of wisdom that Steve has? Like, as you said, because there are many things that he can read, has this intuition, and also on timing. And those are probably far more important than strategy and product, although those are important
Yeah,
too.
I mean, there's a couple of examples. I remember, in the early days with Steve, when I saw the graphical user interface, and it wasn't a huge, it didn't have 7 or 8 applications. It had a word processor and a drawing package, and I thought, okay, this could be the datagramming that I'm looking for, right? Where people can who are familiar with the desktop can move files from one application to another in the same way we move papers from one folder to another. And I remember, because I wrote a paper, I wrote a couple papers. One of them was called How the Apple Was Lost on the Way to School. Because I felt that, I said, well, Steve's vision for Apple was the mental bicycle. But if the education community isn't careful, they will turn technology into a exercise bike, something that's boring and doesn't go anywhere. But I remember seeing the initial essence of the graphical user interface and saying, okay, this is the direction that we need to go. And so Steve and I came back to the executive board, the board at Apple, and said, we think that the next computer should look like this. That's what he hired me to do. And they said, well, what will happen to the Apple II business? And Steve and I looked at each other. We said, well, it will be destroyed, but better by us. And see, Steve was always willing to throw something good away to do something better. And the example probably is the best-selling iPod. He obsoleted 2 months before Christmas and came out with a new one. Meanwhile, all the competition was looking at the existing iPod and had no idea that we were crazy enough, to stop the production of that to come out with a new one. And, Steve used to say, I used a dartboard. He used to use an archery. It didn't matter, but he said, let's throw the first dart, make that the bullseye, and then everybody else can throw second. And I think that came from Walt Disney, who was another one of Steve's, not idols, but someone who he respected, because I think Walt Disney was asked about animation. He said, aren't you concerned that people are copying you? And I believe that Walt said, well, if I spend all my time worrying about people copying me, I will never have enough time to do something new. And that was Steve, and the other thing he used to say, I shared with him, because at HP I learned when we did the first handheld calculator, it was HP 35. It add, subtracted, multiplied, divided in reverse Polish, and it was going out to market at $395. And the market research said, don't build it because nobody wants it. But Bill Hewlett said, I want it, and furthermore, I want it to fit in my shirt pocket. And 9 months later, it was doing $180 million in revenue. And the largest slide rule company was out of business because they thought they were in the slide rule business, the what, and not the computational business, the why. And I learned that market research is only valid in an existing market, right? Henry Ford said if he'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? Not this automobile that bounced around, that had to stop for gas, that had to have insurance, that roads had to be built, and gas, the whole infrastructure had to be built around that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, there are two things that deeply touch me. One is, of course, is this market research only exists in existing market, and many things is about creating something that never existed before. And second is this ability to destroy something you created. I found this deeply Zen or deeply Buddhist. I think that's of course part of Steve's journey as well. Is
Yes.
that kind of going back to zero, like in Chinese called guilin. So it's something very difficult to forgive. I mean, to forgo, because it's in our mind works that already came so far, right? And this is sort of working, right? I mean, it's making some money. It's very hard to give away and saying, oh, now let's destroy it and start something new. So there's a very deep spiritual sort of energy behind it for something to take that action. Yeah.
Well, like Steve would said at a commencement, we can only connect the dots looking backwards. We cannot connect the dots looking forward. And, for me, I get sort of inner messages, and the message one time is the past is past, move on. And also not to make my decisions based on money. Just, money is just a way of keeping score, for people. It can come and it can go. I was fortunate because when my father was killed, my grandfather, who was crippled, lived in Chicago and had a produce company, and he sold his company at age 50, and he moved to Riverside, California, and taught me how to ride a bike, taught me how to ride a car, and everything in between. And it doesn't get any better than being the firstborn in an Italian family and being raised by your grandfather. And he drove a cab for 30 years. No pride, right? Because he was crippled and that's what he could do. And it was his way of giving back to the community. And that's kind of where I am in my life right now with my winery, I have a tasting room. My tasting room is equivalent of my grandfather's cab. And I have a Waz Chardonnay, because Waz is my hero. I have a Jewel Pinot after the singer Jewel, because she's one of my heroes. And I'm coming out with a Joe's Cab after my grandfather. And
Father.
so
Wow.
everything has a story. Everything
Yeah.
has a story. And I'm meeting everybody in the community, all the visitors that come here, and a lot come here. It's my way of giving back. And that's
Wow.
where my books are. My books are free in the tasting room, because they tell a story. Now, unfortunately, everybody wants to hear the story about my accomplishments. And the new book is not about my accomplishments, it's about my faith. And that book will be in the tasting room as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. And no, I was deeply touched. Thank you for sharing that story. And then exactly as you said, I think usually people see the sort of the tip of the iceberg and see, okay, this is you're rich,
They
you have
see
the
the
wine,
external. They see the
right,
external, right?
external.
The
Exactly.
accomplishment. They
Right.
don't know. They don't know what I went through with losing my dad, losing sisters, losing my brother, um, losing a wife of 30 something years, divorce. Um, those, they don't see the scars that we all carry,
Yes.
and
Yes.
um, and I think if they did, we would have a lot more empathy for people. Um, you know, I think there will always be wars, unfortunately, because there's always good and there's always evil. But I think we can help our brothers and our sisters in life. And I'm blessed that I can do that. I have my friend of mine when I met him at 17 years old, who's coming tonight, you know, and he can't drive anymore, and he still walks with a cane, and he's on dialysis, and he's living on Social Security, and he needs help. And so, he always comes at normally at the end of the month, because that's when he runs out of money. And, and I take him to nice restaurants, and, he's a good friend. And, I'm blessed that I can help. So,
Yeah.
and that's,
Yeah.
that really, and that's why I wrote both of those books. Both of those books, um, were let's let the people know the truth about Steve, that he was human. Let's raise, the challenge that we have with education. It can't be about memorization anymore.
Mhm.
One of my favorite, I just finished a documentary, by the way, called
Ah,
the death of recess,
the
because
death.
they've gotten rid of recess. And everybody knows that you need a break, intellectual break, physical exercise. We just finished that. And I was the producer for Sound of Freedom, because I wanted to bring to the surface, uh, what's really happening with children around the world. And
Yeah.
that was my purpose for the books too, is to bring to the surface. Um, and the death of recess, I've got, Todd Rose in there. I've got Sir Ken Robinson. I've got the Brain Rules guy, and it's going really well. But one of my favorite things that I used to use in my talks was the NASA test for creativity. When
Mhm.
John Kennedy set the challenge to go to the moon, NASA said, "Well, what kind of people do we need to hire?" Right?
John, 1 second, John. Sorry. Can you tilt the screen a
Yeah, there
little
you
bit?
go. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's blocked for me, so I can't see it, because it says
Oh,
this
okay.
meeting is being recorded.
Now it
Um,
looks perfect. Yeah.
so NASA said, "Well, what kind of people do we need to hire?" Because there's no books, right, for the answer to this. And so they went to Dr. Land of Polaroid, and they asked him to create a creativity test. And they used that as a filter to hire really, creative people that got us, the United States, to the moon. Well, someone decided that let's test fifth graders or 5-year-olds. And 98% of five-year-olds
To
tested
pass the test. Yeah.
creative, okay? And they did it every 5 years. And every 5 years, the number went down, down, down until those kids became adults. You know what percentage of them were creative as adults?
Single
2%.
digit. 2%. Yeah.
2%. So you go, well, what happened? Education happened, right? And, education is what people do to us. Learning is what we do for ourselves. And that's the essence of the education book.
Yeah.
It talks about intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation. The kids are so creative. And we just layer it out of them. We just put year after year after year of memorization and concrete. In fact, the original kindergarten was created in Germany, and it stands for Children in the Garden, because the teacher was a son of a Lutheran minister who saw children as being creative. It had nothing to do with literacy, right? And but when it came into the United States, they pushed literacy from first grade down into kindergarten, even though we know that kids are going to read at different periods of their life. In fact, I have a new company right now called Crescendo Studios that I'm working with a young lady who was an opera singer, and COVID cut her career short, but we are developing animations and games based on complex music and neuroscience for preschoolers and early age students, because we know that music improves language development and math skills. And a lot of music programs have been cut, like recess. So I'm still, I'm still knee deep in it with both feet. So,
Well, that's remarkable, because I know, of course, the U.S. education contest is, when you're in there, you feel it's a mess. But as you probably know, we started a school ourselves in China since 2016. And the death of recess is much more real. So it was even before the death of recess was only like 10 minutes between classes. And now they're cutting that down. The 10 minutes is becoming indoor recess, meaning like, if you have to indoor. Yeah. And then I was like, wow. And then it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And then the few books I've written, those are in Chinese. Of course, it's by the same publisher. That's why we have this fortune. I have this fortune to have this conversation with you, is to look deeper, beyond all those measures that seems reasonable, right? Of course, we need to study more. There's better material, there's better score test. And there is this almost like a inertia that people believe the more study leads to more results. But I think if you look beyond the inertia, there is also a much deeper sense of fear, meaning like we are very fearful, right? So we think if we put kids through some kind of standard sort of assembly line kind of process, it ensures some type of success. I think that was the inertia deep and wide in our subconscious, right?
Well, it's kind of ironic. I think in the United States, the kids take, I think it was something like 120 tests. I mean, we're taking time out of the learning environment to test. What's ironic? So I worked with a family in Mexico, Morelia, state of Michoacan in Mexico, and they partnered with the Rodriguez family that owns the Cineplexes, and they built a school called Varmond, VARMOND, and they contracted with Apple Distinguished Educators, and they created a challenge-based learning environment from age 3 through 9th grade. And I think it's in about 50 schools in Mexico and South America. One of the schools didn't even have electricity. All right. It's an iPod environment with challenges, and they don't teach to the test. Everything's a project, challenge-based project. I'll give you an example. The 8th grade class did a solar-powered go-kart, which they had to redo because they picked material that was too heavy. That was the 8th grade class. The 6th grade class built a solar-powered backpack that would charge their iPhone and their iPad. And the 1st grade class built a solar-powered oven. Okay. They scored it, I think it was 6th in the world on the PISA test. And they never tested a test. Never. All right. I'm trying to bring that into the US. And I can't do it as a public school. I have to do it as an alternative. And the death of recess ends with that story. It talks about micro schools, it talks about homeschools, and it goes all over the world, including China, and looking at revolutions, and because we know the revolution has started, it's just not equally distributed. So there's hope for parents, and it basically challenges parents. It says, be the change. Gandhi's, if you're gonna want to change something, then you gotta step up in the gap.
Yeah.
So I'm very much involved with education, both in terms of the books, the documentary, and now this startup called Crescendo Studios.
Wow. When will the documentary come out?
It's available now. If you send me a link on an email, I can send it to you for you to look at it. I met with Angel Studios last week. Angel Studios are the ones that did Chosen and did Sound of Freedom and some new movies. They have a lot of great movies, and they created a new model for the distribution of. They have a guild of 350,000 people who vote on the movies that they should bring out, because streaming is changing everything.
Right.
Technology is changing. AI is changing everything. Our AI book is kind of like a coffee table book, like Ripley's Believe It or Not. I took 30 industries and AI stories that are impacting those industries, and then we challenge the education community to how are you going to better prepare for these changing industries?
Right.
Because we can't keep doing the same thing that we've always done, right? The old insanity quote, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, and which we haven't quite seemed to learn. But like I said, I have 17 grandkids, so I have my own petri dish,
Right.
and I always buy them kits. Froebel kits who was the inventor of kindergarten. There's an ex-Apple employee, I believe NASA as well, called Crunch Labs, where he sends out these kits.
Mark Rober. Yeah, my kids love him.
Yeah.
Mark Rober. Yeah, he's a hero.
Yeah. Well, I bought those for all my grandkids,
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the age range of your grandkids? How old are they?
4 to 26.
Wow. Look at you.
Yeah.
You're a wealthy grandpa.
Yeah, it's who knew? I mean, but I think my kids grew up in like I did. I grew up in a great, healthy, believing family. And I wanted to model that my kids growing up, and they, my son said, "Dad, I had so much fun with, 4 of us. I want to have 4." I think he's got 5 now, and I moved everybody here. So they're all here. And that's why I have to build this big, this big Tuscan villa. So I've got 48-foot long table for food to come out and everybody to sit and drink wine.
Wow, that's so Italian, but so Asian as well. It's very Chinese too.
Yeah, it's Mexican too. It's
Mexican too.
it's family. It's the way it should be.
Yeah, it's like a multi-generation sort of a family community living, which is probably most close to human nature, but it has been in a way ripped apart,
Yeah.
with modern urbanization.
Well, I've got a new movie coming out called The Italians. It's a comedy, and it's about a dinner, which is what we had every Sunday. I'll never forget. I brought my first girlfriend home for a Sunday dinner, and she was English and German. And I was so embarrassed because everybody's talking with their hands, and if food's flying, and everybody's talking at the same time. And I'm just going, oh my gosh, how embarrassing. But this is the culture that I grew up in, you know?
But now there's a lot of research in education saying that how important that kind of culture is, because that's how children build their connection to other
Community.
people, to the
It's a
world,
community. Yeah.
right? And then also to solve conflicts, because there are lots of conflicts with
Yeah,
cousins.
that's for sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Then they're
Yeah,
saying
who gets the turkey breast first, you know?
exactly. So yeah, so it's almost the undervalued aspect of education. And people kind of equate education to learning or arithmetic, reading, but they kind of course, there's a word called social emotional learning, which is also something we've been trying to
Big,
do since our
yes.
school. But
Yeah,
that's traditionally has been brought basically by the family community. Like that's where you're educated by how to be with a crowd, how to, confront and resolve conflicts. And those are things that are becoming a bit artificial now.
yeah. Well, when
Right.
you look at the number of kids that are being raised by either single moms, you
Yeah,
know,
it's a huge
it's
percentage.
it's ridiculous, and they have no father figure, no one to really set the boundaries for their lives, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
my
yeah.
my stepdad, I could do anything and be forgiven with the one exception, and that was to disrespect my mom. If I disrespected my mom, man, he would chase me all over the yard, you know.
Let me teach you some lesson.
Well, and so, I learned, how to respect my wife, and all my sons respect their wives. They help them with the chores. They help, take care of the kids. I never played golf because I never wanted to take that time away from the family. I let my wife sleep in on Saturday, and I would take the kids, to the hardware store to do whatever we needed for that weekend, take them to breakfast, and then come back. So it's just, that, like you said, that's what the community teaches you.
Yeah, well, you should write another book on how to be a family man.
No, thanks. Uh, I'm hoping The Ordinary Man will cover that.
Right, yeah, indeed. I
Yeah.
imagine as well. So last question I have, John, is around probably more education, both your role as a father, as a grandpa, of course, as somebody who runs school and has been the head of Apple Education. So I think lots of our readers are anxious today because of development of AI, this, and then the world seems to be much more divided than it needs to be and all that. So like I think people are trying to work hard, or work their kids hard on education, in the belief that this will prepare them better for the future. But of course, on the same time, people don't know what to prepare for. So I wonder for you, with this wealth of experience, both professionally and personally as a family, what do you think about these problems? And if you do, what would be your answer?
Well, again, memorizing, isn't going to get you anywhere. John Medina in Brain Rules talks about it takes 10 years for something to get into your brain permanently. Okay. And I challenged him on that. And John's in the Death of Recess documentary. And I said, John, that can't be true. And he goes, okay, John. He goes, what was your phone number when you were in elementary school? I said, that's easy. 714-682-6377. He goes, what was your phone number when you were in university? I go, I have no idea. No idea. So he proved to me that something that was repetitive for 10 years can be in your brain permanently. My my view on things is not to walk in well-worn footsteps, but to have the confidence to have, it's like I said, education is what people do to you. Learning is what you do for yourself. So you need to learn. You know, my daughters and two of my daughter and my son's wife all homeschool. And when I asked Heaney, who's in 8th grade, what his favorite subject was, he said geology. Well, I didn't get introduced to geology until it was elective in my sophomore year in college. So they're not just staying at the surface. Their projects integrate deep. And you know, I mean, I read a paper where the common characteristic between the last 100 Nobel Prize winners was they were multidisciplined. They could do chemistry and biology. They could cross, and that's where the innovations come from. So that's why I like things like the Crunch Labs. I like kids to be able to solve problems. What are you interested in? You know, when I was living down, when I had a home at the desert, one of the challenges in the desert was your water safe to drink? Because we had been taking a lot of waste and putting them on Indian reservations. And so the 8th grade kids in that school decided that their project is our water safe to drink? Okay. And in attempting to answer that question, they learned the periodic chart. They learned what the elements of water was. And they found that the arsenic level in their water was high. And then that prompted new questions like, well, who determines what's high and what's not? You know, and it's a learning environment. It's like throwing that pebble in the pond, and it just goes and goes and goes. And you find what you're passionate about in those projects. There was a project in Texas in the was 11th grade class on anatomy. And the kids wanted to create an anatomy class for first graders. So they formed teams, and the young girl that was chosen to do the animations, you know, the not the animations, but the graphics, the designs and everything, was not considered to be one of the better students. But today, she's a medical illustrator because of that experience, you know. Now, what in our education even gives you the hint that there's a job for medical illustration, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I like about challenge-based learning, you know. It opens the door for something that you may be passionate about, that you maybe you don't even know you're passionate about it until you attempt it.
Yeah. But a question I always get myself as, of course, somebody who runs schools is that, well, that sounds all good, but first of all, usually teachers are limits, because you need, you know, teachers who are adults who believe in that and then can create a space for children. And second is that, well, that seems to be good, but that's too slow.
Yeah. Well, you know, the way I let me answer that with a story, okay? Simon Sinek's latest book is I think it's called the Infinite Game.
Infinite
The
game.
End Game. Okay, Infinite Game. Okay. Well, Simon did a podcast, and he said, I had the good fortune of speaking at both Microsoft's education conference and Apple's education conference. And he said at the Microsoft education conference, everybody on stage talked about how to beat Apple. But at the Apple's education conference, everybody on stage talked about how to improve teaching and learning. Okay. And he said, I had the good fortune to be ride back to the hotel with the head of education. Moi, right? And he says, I thought I would challenge him. And I told him that Microsoft gave me a Zune, right? Which was their equivalent of the iPod. And he says, I think it's a better product than the iPod. And my answer in the cab was, it may be, period. And so what Simon took out of that story was that Apple was in for the infinite game, not a product by product by product. And I think we have to treat learning the same way as an infinite game, you know, not based on a test score that will be forgotten in 3 months over the summer, you know. And that's why I like challenging the kids. And you know, if our education system doesn't change, then it will destroy itself. And it's the process of doing that. I had written a follow-on book to Rewiring, and it's called System Failure.
System failure.
But what happened, but I was talking about the pedagogy, right? But what happened with COVID is COVID opened the kimono to the schools and the politics that were being played in the school, that it was about money. It wasn't about the students. And a lot of people have left the education system because of that. But I didn't want to do a book on politics. So I jettisoned it and did the AI, you know, book instead. You know, I think we as parents, you know, have a lot. I personally believe that I'm responsible for the education of my children. Now, I choose to partner with hopefully some professionals, but if their vision of education and my vision of education are different, then I shouldn't be partnering with them. And that's why when I took over that failed school and I looked for a vision that would capture the school, I came up with the term beyond potential, because I wanted a learning environment that took a student and the teacher beyond what they thought their potential was, you know, beyond the limits of the boundaries, back into the creative, to the innovative world, to, you know, to solve problems that hadn't been solved. Everything we need as a society moving forward. You know, global warming is going to be solved by technology, you know, not by politicians, you know. And therefore we should be preparing kids to solve problems, not to fear them. So
well said. And I like the two things you said. One, of course, is the concept of the infinite game. I think it's not only education is infinite game, our life is an infinite game.
yes.
Right. Right. At the end of the day, like, right, you know, what life is about if it's not.
See, that's particularly true in the Christian world, right? You know, people say religion is man's search for God. Christianity is God's search for man, and it talks about eternal life and infinite life. Anyway, that's why I like Cal Poly, because Cal Poly's theme is learn by doing. So the kids do everything. The kids make the wine, they make the cheese, they make the chocolate, you know, they everything the kids do. So when you hire a graduate from Cal Poly, okay, you know they can get the job done. In fact, most of the businesses in this community were senior projects.
Wow.
You know, Jamba Juice was a senior project, right? Yeah. And so you walk around this community and you go, well, that was a senior project. That was a senior project. That was a senior project, you know?
Wow. Because
And
I've seen your
they're
sharing.
unique.
Yeah, I've seen your sharing on on the Cal Poly campus for small businesses. I actually watched your interview there, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I do a lot with the Entrepreneurial Center.
Right.
And they just hired a new head she is really, really sharp. She came out of the industry, technology. So one of my grandsons is a junior there, and he's interdisciplinary studies right now. So he's doing a little bit of everything. And his project's going to be, Cal Poly had property in the Santa Cruz Mountains that burnt down. And his project is how to resurrect that property so that it has some agricultural value.
I see. Wow.
At home, they're creating truffles. You know, they're boring into an old oak trees, and they're, and they're trying to come up with truffles.
Wow.
So,
Yeah. Well,
but
the
that's,
second
that's what makes life exciting.
sure,
You know?
exactly. It's the real challenges in front of you, and then
Yeah.
you're interfacing it, right? Rather than creating, yeah, some artificial problems to solve. Yeah. But the second thing I want to pick up from what you said is that when you said that you believe you are responsible for your children's education, I think that's very powerful too, because I think in probably most people would think, okay, there is an education system, which is like a factory or whatever, or assembly line,
Yeah.
that my job is to send my kids into one. And I may have a choice of, assembly line number one, number two, number three, they're different styles. And I put them in, and then whatever comes out of it. And I think your mindset is that no, I am responsible, and I pick and work with the partners in support of that. But I would give you another challenge for that, because this is something I advocate as well. But people would say, oh, well, you can do that because you are privileged. Okay, so you have a choice. You have, like, I don't. Like, then we are sort of stuck with that system. What would be your response to that? That this
Well, I mean, see, I think those people live in the present and think that the present is the future. And it's not. We are free to move, may not be your priority, but we are free to move. I moved out of Silicon Valley. I'm starting a whole new life here, which means I've got to new friends. I've got to climb the mountain again, right? Um, and we're homeschooling, and my daughter's is in the movie, is in the documentary, and and her husband's, I remember her husband saying, I can't change the education system, but I can change the education of my kids. And I think, there's a difference. You
Yeah.
don't have to go to that public school. China's unique is in the sense that you just have, so many kids, but they're not speaking 180 different languages like kids in LA. I mean, that's a big challenge. In my book, there's an example of a 5th grade class in Chicago, Illinois, where one kid is reading at the 8th grade level, one kid is reading at the 1st grade level, and I believe there's 5 or 6 different reading levels. The time that it would take a teacher to find the appropriate material for each of those levels is more than 40 hours a week. So fundamentally, we're asking our teachers to perform a miracle. And I used to tell Steve used to come to me and he'd said, I want every application in the world running on the Apple II by Christmas, and I'd say, Steve, 1, I don't have a monopoly on creativity. And 2, I believe in miracles, but I don't believe in scheduling them. Only God can schedule them. And the last time I looked, you're not God, Well, we ask our teachers to schedule a miracle. So what does she do? She teaches to the average. So the poor, even if she took that 1st grade reader to the 4th grade level, she would be deemed a failure because she wasn't reading at the 5th grade level. So she destroys him and his motivation, and the 8th grade person gets bored, and we lose him too. And that's where, Todd Rose, when he wrote End of Average. So Todd wrote End of Average while I was writing, Rewiring Education. Mine was coming from practical experience of having run Apple's education for 18 years and having been in a school for 10. Todd was coming more from the academic research perspective, but they both came to the same conclusion, that there is no such thing as average. And any institution that relies on average is doomed to fail.
Yeah, because
And his
average is,
example, his example was the pilots.
Mhm.
He was the pilot example.
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
somebody designed an average cockpit seat primarily for men in the 40s, right? And there are no average sizes. So it's fascinating, but I think we just get so busy focusing on day in and day out, that we don't step back. I spend 2 hours every morning in quiet time. Okay. Everything's off. I read, I journal, I post, and it's changed my life. Now I can do it now at 77 years old. Okay. I probably couldn't do that when I was 29 dealing with the pace that Apple was growing at, but I can do it now. And I think everybody could do, 15 minutes and just sit back and say, am I leading my family in the right direction? In fact, I do a lot of talks to business execs who are in the middle of a divorce. And I said, you would never think of starting a business without a business plan. And my model for the business plan is vision, clarifies one's mission, gives it uniqueness in the directions, creative steps, et cetera. But I said, have you ever really thought about a life plan? Have you ever really thought of why am I even on here? And and we all have different circumstances, and we've got to figure out the why, and that should clarify the what and the directions, and the people that are taking that journey with you, and what are your guidelines, you know? And so that's also going to be part of my new book, is a challenge to people to, slow down, they smell the roses, breathe the air, be thankful that you can breathe the air, because not everybody is so fortunate. See nature. Not everybody can see nature, what's the immediate challenges around you, and how can you overcome those challenges, whether they be personal or community, and that's what I liked about the Varmon curriculum. The kids, it's kind of this me, my family, my community, my world, and they start at age 3, 4, and 5, and they go to 18 different countries. So the kids are involved in, they understand 18 different cultures before they go to first grade. And they know where they fit. They know their role in the family. They know their role in the community, and how they can give back to the world. And I think so many, in Death of Recess is about a young man who they canceled recess when he was in 6th grade. He was passionate about making movies. There was nothing in the school that would allow him to do that, and he said that I was pushed into college, even though I didn't know what I wanted to do. I woke up and I had $85,000 in debt, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And so he moved to LA, and he did stupid TikTok movies to pay his $85,000 back, and then said, wait a minute, what am I doing with my life? So it's his story. And what I brought to it was the academic disciplines, how our brains work, things and so it gave it credibility. And his story became credible, and he's got Sir Ken Robinson in there, who was incredible, and Brain Rules, and it's really good. It's a little long, so we're still trying to cut it down a little bit, and we wanted it to be positive. We didn't want it to be a negative thing. But we got a standing ovation from the teachers when it was filmed, when it was showed here at a film, because they're battling it every day. They're
Yeah.
battling in administration.
Yeah.
Technology is not used to empower the kids. Technology is used to run the administrative state, the controlling state. And they're frustrated,
Yeah.
and they care about the kids. At least most of them do. you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
heard, yeah, yeah. I heard one teacher one day said, it was first grade, she goes, I told those kids that in my classroom, this is my home. And in my home, you have to respect me. And I walked up to her and I said, no, respect comes from the person, not the position. They will not respect you until you respect them.
Yeah. I think education is the deepest entangle, uh, right, at a personal level and social level. So that's why, that's why part of your journey is fascinating because of course you have a very technical, technology view. And of course, because of your own faith, your own life stories, you're very deep in,
You
yeah,
know, Mike Markula once told me, he says, when you have a problem the size of a 20,000-pound marshmallow, no matter how many times you push on it, it pushes back. The only way you can defeat it is by one bite at a time. We got to get enough people willing to take those bites to destroy those 20,000-pound marshmallow challenges.
Yeah, and going back to what your, I think, son-in-law said, you said, I can't change the education system, but I can change education for my child. And then
Yes.
the second part of that statement is when more people start thinking and acting that way, then the education system is changing,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
That,
Yeah, it does. And, and I think the Crunch Lab kits, the different types of things that I bought, the Freuble had a Freuble kit. Because it has a bunch of strings and beads and everything. And what you're supposed to do is you go out in nature, you would see something, and then you would come back and you would design something that reflected nature. And it's still used in the MIT's Graduate School of Architecture. Okay, I bought all those kits for my kids. So I know that China has so many people spend so much more money outside the mainline education trying to help their kids. That's how I met the people from Squirrel AI, because he read my book and said, I love your book. I want this book in China. And I said, well, I wrote this book based on my experience in the US culture. I said, why don't you take it and write a chapter for the Chinese culture? And he said, you'd let me do that? And I said, yes. And so that's how the initial rewiring book came for China,
Chinese.
because he wrote a chapter for the Chinese. And he has those after school programs, those AI after school programs. And Japan's the same way, parents spent a ton of money outside
Yeah, on
the
tutoring.
educational system.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's a further death of recess.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
only the death of
death
recess.
of learning is what it's called. It was sad because in the documentary, he got a big bus called the Debt Buster bus and went around to universities, and the kids signed on the bus their debt. Some were as much as $500,000, which there's no way they'll ever be able to repay it
Yeah,
unless you start a company, you know?
I know. Wow, I
Yeah.
know.
I'll send you the link.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and you know, all right. Well,
Yeah,
what else you got for me?
I know. It has been a while. Thank you so much. Can you John, can you probably tilt a little bit your screen
Yeah,
again?
no, I was looking at the notes that you sent me to see if there were some things that we hadn't covered.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, there are a lot of things we didn't cover, but I think I didn't really stick to this script. And I think what you
That's fine, because I don't like walking on well-worn footsteps,
me too,
I
me
don't
too.
like a process defined.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Because usually that's and the publisher did a good job putting it together. But I read your book, so I just wanted to have a conversation. And thank you so much for sharing all these other aspects. That's such a deeper part of yourself. I think those are fascinating. And then that's
I should tell you one more story, because I was, Rewiring was the #1 education book in China.
hmm,
And they had asked me to come back, and they had
mhm,
lined up a pretty good sized city tour.
mhm.
And it was, I was scheduled to travel to China in December. I believe it was 2019. And I had this inner voice say, don't go. And I go, wait a minute, why not? I mean, I got first class tickets. I got great people who are going to take me around. Last time I got to see the Wall of China, I got to do a podcast. I got to do a talk with one of your educators, and 750,000 people listened to it. I go, it's a great opportunity. My dance card's empty. I'm not married. But the voice just kept saying, don't go, don't go. I would have been in China when COVID broke out. So go figure, it's just one of those things in life that has no explanation for it.
Yeah.
Explanation for it, So I missed out on that particular trip,
Now you're coming back.
But anyway, yeah.
Yeah. And I want to make a comment on the one you talked about. You spend 2 hours of quiet time every day. I don't know if you listen to, you probably must know Yuval Harris. So he has a recent conversation with John Kapazin, who's the mindfulness master.
Yeah.
He's 80. And I recently had a conversation with him as well, with John Kapazin. And he put out his conversation with Yuval Harris, who just wrote Nexus. And he talked about the same. He said every day he spent 2 hours meditating. And that's how he got all this time. It's
Well, that's why you see, I support Jewel, because Jewel is her whole focus on her inspiring young children is mindfulness. And I don't know if you follow that, but I give $20 a bottle to her foundation, and she left home at 14. She has a great story. Her book's probably one of the best books I ever read, called Never Broken, which is her story.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Right.
Anyway, yeah, she's a good friend. I brought her to Cal Poly. I'm bringing Steve Wozniak to Cal Poly on November 7th. We're a little sleepy agricultural town, so
But
we're bringing people in to kind of just, say, look, folks, life can be big.
Right.
Joyful.
Yeah. It's remarkable. Well, thank you so much, John. And this is and thank you for being so open and so generous with both your time and your stories, and then your wisdom, of course.
Oh, I'll have to send you one more thing, okay?
Yes,
Because I just did an interview with David. He's one of the top tech writers, and he's writing a book on Apple's 50th anniversary. David Pogue, okay? And I did a 2.5-hour interview with him, and he sent me, as a thank you, a hip hop song, and it's hilarious. And I guess he used AI to do it, and I'll send that to you also with the documentary.
Yeah,
And
please.
you'll get a kick out of it,
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I will send you. I think the publisher have my email, and then they can connect us. I'll ask them.
Please.
Yeah. And then I would love to stay in touch. And I think if there's any role I can, because I'm currently in Japan. Part of my role is